Good afternoon, everybody. This is week 3 of English 1133 for fall 2020. We are at a point of transition in the quarter. You have just finished drafting your first major paper. I met with most of you to discuss some options for improving your first draft, kind of to clarify how that paper should look. So one thing we're going to do today is talk about how to transition to that second paper, to the concept of discourse community. So I'll get to that in the second half. But I also want to kind of do a series of sort of mini lessons that I think will help you as you finish up those revisions and as you look forward to working on your writing as well. One function of this class is to help you move from high school writing to college writing. And the fact is, you all come from different backgrounds. Some of you graduated high school last year, and maybe you had a college prep course, or you did some fairly advanced training. Some of you are actually in high school now, doing dual enrollment. Others, it's been a while, or maybe you're not quite as confident in your writing. And so that move from high school to college writing, especially with everything else that we're transitioning into, can be really difficult. So I wanted to take some time in this lecture to hit some points that I think will help you, and use that as sort of a supplement to the individual feedback I've given you on your first paper draft of the course pretest. So I'm going to switch over to the lecture notes. So we'll look specifically at paper structure, kind of how to organize your thoughts. I want to say something about how to use evidence effectively. That will become particularly important as you move into the second paper. And then I want to spend some time looking at intros and conclusions. These are both pretty difficult parts of your paper. And one reason they're difficult is because you are sort of transitioning from the actual world, the real world, to the argument or the story, or however you want to set this up. But they're also challenging rhetorical tests. In introduction, if you're like me, you kind of want to have the intro perfect. You want to make sure you know exactly what you're doing. You want to clarify for your readers, this is what I want to accomplish in this paper. This is my context. This is my topic. This is my thesis claim. We hit some of those points before. And it can be really useful to have that set up, but it can also bog you down really easily, especially if you're kind of staring at the blank screen and thinking, how am I supposed to do this whole paper? With the conclusion, sometimes you have the opposite problem. You're tired. You've gone through this whole paper. You've been at this for days, sometimes feels like much, much longer. And you want the paper to be over. And so I think that's why there are often kind of weak conclusions, especially in early drafts, because you've already been stressed out about all this other stuff and you want it to go away. So I'm hoping these will be practical for you as you move on to this quarter. And from there, of course, we'll get into paper 2. The reading we're doing is difficult on discourse communities, but we will be tackling that over the course of several weeks. So I want to start by telling you what the assignment looks like, including a timeline for that, and then walk you through the basic definition that John Swales gives of a discourse community, and I'll finish up by giving an example of how that works. So let's dive in. In high school, one format you see very often is the 5-paragraph essay or the 5-paragraph form. Now, I don't think there's any magic number of paragraphs in a good essay. But most of them, especially in kind of grade 7, 8, 9, you're kind of getting started with serious writing, they tend to look the same. There's your intro paragraph. It almost always has a 3-part thesis, or at least an announcement that I'm going to talk about these 3 things. One body paragraph on each of those topics, and then a conclusion, which is honestly often a cut and paste of the introduction. Now, many high school teachers use this model because it's simple. It's one way to organize your thoughts about what's going into the paper, and it's a way to kind of keep track of how it's going. You've heard the 3-part argument many times in many formats. How many sermons have you read this? And or the preacher said, I have 3 points to make about this particular passage or the particular idea. It's an easy way to organize your thoughts. The problem is it tends to damage the argument itself. And one thing you'll notice in college writing, we're a lot more interested in putting together a good argument and analyzing the data than in just marching through and kind of checking all the boxes on the format. So at its worst, I would say the 5-paragraph form tends to leave out a lot of context for your argument. If you don't have the they say part of your argument, what's the starting point? Who has argued about this? What do we already know? Who are you responding to? You're going to have a lot of trouble with the I say part. This is how I'm going to contribute to this conversation. It also tends to oversimplify really complicated evidence. Remember from my very first lecture, one of our principles this quarter is to acknowledge the complexity of whatever we're working with. And it's really hard to do that if you only have 1 paragraph to cover one topic, and especially if your topics don't really relate to each other very well. A similar problem is that by the time you get to the end of this, you feel all this pressure because you have to cram in everything into 5 paragraphs, and you tend to overstate what you've actually demonstrated. Ironically, you also tend to repeat the same basic points about everything. We try to kind of fit everything into one mold and say, well, so here's one topic, and I have this to say about it. Here's the other topic. I have the same thing to say about it. Here's the third topic. Do you see the pattern here? Now, these are supposed to be structural weaknesses. They make the paper a little bit harder to read. They kind of hamstring you in terms of making a good argument. But there's also a rhetorical weakness. Now, another model you might have heard, it's often connected to a 5-paragraph essay, is this one. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. And as far as it goes, this can be very helpful. In fact, that was the first lesson my mom taught me about writing. Tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them. Again, it's as much a mental process as anything to keep yourself organized. I want to think about this differently, though. I want you to tell them what you're going to tell them. Let's start the same way. Tell them, but then tell them why you told them. Because we're not just writing instructions or information. We're writing arguments. And as I said when we talked about thesis statements, you got to make a difference. You've got to show why this matters and what the reader should do, think, or believe differently as a result. I'm going to come back to this in terms of intros and conclusions. What I want to see in your work, both in this course and really what your professors want to see throughout your college career, is a more mature approach to writing. Your arguments should be both informative and persuasive, and you should embrace that complexity. Look for ways to make more sophisticated arguments. Now, that's hard. It requires a lot more work. It requires building up those details. It requires dealing with some uncertainty. It requires dealing with counter arguments, and it's a really stressful process sometimes. But the goal is to make a smarter, kind of more layered argument so that you're not just saying, I have these 3 huge ideas. I'm going to cover one of them in exactly 1 paragraph and move on to the next one. But you're saying, I have 3 smaller parts of already a fairly targeted, fairly sophisticated claim, and I'm going to show in these connected parts of the paper how I'm going to build up that argument. So as I've said before, as you develop your intro and thesis, make a strong and potentially controversial claim. I wrote a lot of comments on the paper 1 rough drafts about this. Rather than just asking a question like, what happens when communication goes wrong? Well, a lot of things, it turns out. Or announcing, I'm going to write about communication. Good for you. What are you claiming about it? What are you arguing? As you go from there, you want to think about structure both in terms of how you argue, but also kind of how your paper looks. I got a few drafts this time around that were 600 to say 750 words, all in one paragraph. Let's avoid that. I want you to break up your break up your paper into paragraphs of about 150 to 200 words. So each paragraph covers one main point. This actually is a lot easier to do when you think about it in terms of an outline and pre-writing. So I suggested this to several of you during our conferences. If you have 1,000 words to write, don't start by thinking, how do I write 1,000 words on this? Start by thinking, how many paragraphs do I have and what goes into each one of them? Because if you start at 200 words and you break that down to say, okay, in these 200 words, I need to set the scene, to introduce the characters. I need to explain what happened in this miscommunication. I need to show the consequences of that. Suddenly, you've got a lot more going on than just body paragraph. Okay, body paragraph. I need to make an argument. I need to write about something. I need to copy something over here, and the wheels kind of spin without going much of anywhere. This also helps you plan what to leave out of each part. Again, it helps to think of telling a story. If you are telling the story of this crazy day you had at work or at school, and you start at the very end, your listeners are going to be confused. And so you want to apply the same logic to your papers. What's really important to put in this section, in this paragraph, in this part, and what would be more effective later on. That brings us to the question of evidence. Now, when you're telling a story, maybe you're thinking more about plot and characters and maybe symbolism and all these kind of creative aspects. Those of you who are into creative writing or music or drama, you know kind of how these rhythms work. When you're dealing with analysis and arguments, though, evidence is front and center. One of the things that I encourage you to do in all your papers, including the discussion posts, is to use a mix of different kinds of evidence. So you're doing some reading in week 3 on summary, and I want to just briefly introduce you to how you can use summary, paraphrase, and direct quotes more effectively, because that's going to be the skeleton of your paper. You present the evidence, and then you kind of flesh out. You say, what is it that is interesting here? What do I want to argue about this? So summaries and paraphrases are similar. Both of them are in your own words, and we'll get what that means in a minute. But a paraphrase rewords kind of a more focused part. So you could summarize, let's take a really complicated book. You could summarize the book of Psalms. There are 150 of them. And so it would have to be a pretty detailed summary to catch all of them. But you could still talk in kind of general terms. You could say Psalms is a series of poems, some set to music, some aren't. They have different tones, different topics. Some are written by David, some are written by others. And they generally serve as sort of mini narratives of the speaker's experience, or some are hymns, some are praises, some are imprecatory songs. Those are really fun. The ones where you say, I'm going to crush my enemy's skulls. Help me, God, crush my enemy's skulls. We don't talk about those much. Now, that only gets you so far for understanding a particular psalm. If you wanted to paraphrase Psalm 23, then you have to engage much more closely with the specific language of the text. You probably have to mention sheep or shepherds in there somewhere. And you could find some way to communicate those same ideas in other words. So, at some point, you've probably read or heard of the Message Bible. Now, it's not actually a Bible in the sense that it's not obviously the inspired word of God. It's not even a translation. It is a paraphrase by Eugene Peterson. So it's kind of a theologian, devotional writer. He tried to express the ideas he saw in language that he thought would be more accessible. And so, as we'll see, he kind of makes some changes there. We're going to come back to ways to use quotes in a couple of minutes, but let me show you we can run through the basic terms here. Here's our quote. Jefferson, obviously, Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. You might pull on this quote because you want to deal with a specific language, because it echoes a sentiment that you think is important for 100 different reasons. If you were to paraphrase it, notice a couple of things here. One, you keep this in the same voice. So here, first person plural, we. But you're going to keep that we think. Now, the wording here is different, and it's important to acknowledge that you make certain rhetorical choices every time you paraphrase something. And some paraphrases are maybe not as accurate. So we have the original here. We hold these truths becomes, we think it's obvious. That all men are created equal becomes that people are inherently equal. And you can make a good argument that some of the changes in this paraphrase actually distort or don't fully represent some of the original meaning. For instance, you could argue that the original phrase here, all men, in theory at least, and based on other 18th century practice, meant all humans, men and women. But we can also point out that in the time that Jefferson was writing, political power was basically reserved for white male property owners. Everyone else, sorry. Kind of was a big deal a little bit later on in a certain Civil War, jumping ahead a little bit. Likewise, you could look at some phrase like created equal and argue, as many have, that this indicates some sort of Judeo-Christian ethic, some sort of assumption that the equality, this political and philosophical concept, is tied to the act of creation. And whether Thomas Jefferson himself actually believed that is another slightly thornier question. The Jefferson Bible has some interesting alterations to it. But my point is, you're making these changes, and so you want to be careful that you don't necessarily see that the paraphrase equals the same as the quote. When you move to the summary, you're switching from kind of imitating the voice of the original, for we to we here, to describing it. So you're going to switch to third person. Jefferson believes that human equality is part of human nature, and he thinks this view should be clear to everyone. Again, look at what happens to the original quotes here. We have the same idea going from all men to people, human nature here. And we have, instead of hold these truths to be self-evident, he thinks this view should be clear to everyone. In this case, the summary is actually longer than the original quote. And sometimes that happens, depending on the complexity of the thing you have to summarize. So you've got these three main options to present your evidence. I want to dig a little deeper into using quotes specifically, because you're more likely to run into requirements, especially in academic papers, to bring in a certain number of quotes or to analyze quotes in a certain way. So I think it's helpful to pause there for a little bit. So the first question is, how do you choose what to quote? Well, get used to quoting relatively small chunks of the text. Rather than putting even an entire sentence, let alone the entire 5 or 6 verse chunk, highlight what is most relevant to your immediate point. I see a lot of students, whether because they need to fill space in their paper or because they're not sure how to deal with the quote, they'll just grab the whole paragraph and stick it in the paper, and then they'll have a sentence to follow up. And it's kind of frustrating because I don't know what is it in that quote do they really want me to pay attention to. A second principle is to keep the argument central. Every word of your paper should help you advance your argument. If it's not doing that, you probably need to delete that word. Be merciless. So, especially when you're adding quotes, make sure that it connects to your argument. You could say it kind of points back to your thesis, your main claim, but also it relates to the main idea of your paragraph. Because again, sometimes I will see rough drafts that will have a great quote from the text, but it has nothing at all to do with what the student is talking about in that particular section. So you should be able to explain, even if it's only to yourself, that this quote is important and relevant and interesting because of these reasons, and use that as sort of the entrance requirements before you actually put it into your paragraph. There can be occasions to use block quotes. Those are formatted a little bit differently, and you can refer to in conversation for instructions on that. Generally, I put a block quote in if I use more than 3 lines on the screen. Now, you're writing short papers, so for these papers, you almost never will need block quotes. And if you have them, maybe 1 block quote per paper, honestly. And under 5 pages, I would avoid block quotes. If you do include it, then you want to make sure you use all of that evidence. So again, think here of sermons. If you are reading a chunk of 10 or 12 verses, and it can be from pretty much any part of the Bible because there's a lot of dense prose in there, you're not going to have time to unpack every single word, every single idea, every single implication. Now, if you're John Piper, you might try. If you're John MacArthur, you will try, then you will do it. Wrote 5 books about it. In a paper, though, you want to focus your reader's attention on the evidence that's most important to the point you want to make. So if you decide you need to quote that whole chunk, that whole paragraph, you'd better do a lot to follow up, to analyze how that's working. Otherwise, it's just going to look like you're filling space. In terms of integrating these quotes, a couple of pieces of advice here. You want to use a signal phrase to set this up. So rather than just starting your sentence with a quote, it can be as simple as Smith argues this, or we see in this verse that Jesus says this. The idea is to make a smoother transition from your words to your source. And I'll give you some links for that in a minute to help you practice. One of my favorite metaphors for this is the quote sandwich. So, we're going to start off with the first piece of bread, and that is going to introduce and contextualize the quote, kind of set it up. That could be a signal phrase, that could be a sentence or two saying, all right, so later on in chapter 5, we find blah, 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 blah. You're going to give the quote and, of course, cite it. That will look a little bit differently depending on what citation style you're using. That's the meat, or the peanut butter and jelly, or the kale if you really want to. And then the last piece of bread is the response. You want to respond to that quote, analyze it, say something interesting, show why it's important in terms of your own argument. So that's why it's got to do the signpost. Point back to your claims, your thesis, but also point kind of around to the rest of the paragraph. Show that it is important for what you're doing there. I would say if you're analyzing a text, if you're describing how it works or applying it, no more than 15% of the paper should be direct quotes. Now, you might have some more summary or paraphrases in there. I'm not going to go through and count words and fail you if you have 16% of quotes. But I want you to keep that ratio in mind because this is your paper, this is your argument. And so you want to use most of the space to do that work, to do your own analysis rather than just saying, so here's a whole bunch of stuff that we could talk about. Last advice here, after you give a quote, please do something beyond just summarizing it. It's okay if you want to explain briefly, okay, so what he's saying here is this, but don't stop there. Move on to say, what's important about this idea is X. you often will have to kind of translate stuff, so to speak, explain what it actually means, especially if you're dealing with an older text, like, say, the Bible. Uh, my academic field is 19th century American fiction. A lot of the 19th century prose is hard to understand, even for specialists like me. And so if I'm teaching something in a class, then I might start out, like, read a quote and say, okay, so basically this means blah, 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 blah. Now, let's see, what do we do with this? Why is this important? How does this connect to the argument I'm trying to make? How does this complicate what I'm doing? Because if I just see a quote and then say, the author means this, especially if it's just, what Jefferson is saying here is that really all men are created equal. And he says that this should be kind of truth that is sort of, like self-evident and stuff. Uh-huh, thanks. I read the quote too. What do you have to say about it? What is interesting about your take? Why should I keep listening to you? Your readers are constantly going to be thinking this, even if they're getting paid to read your papers. So, you can read on in conversation chapters for more information on that. I'm going to give you a couple of links that will help with some examples there before we move on. So those are for your files. By the way, if I try to keep these links up to date, but if you do find something is 404, please let me know. I'll see if we can find a good replacement. Sometimes they just move around, especially on school websites. I want to move on then to thinking about introductions. I mentioned earlier that these are some of the hardest things to write because there's a lot going on, and it's often your very first time you kind of think seriously and try to organize what you're doing with this whole thing. And the logic applies to other situations you've encountered in life. How many times have you stressed out about making a good first impression on a professor or an employer or that cute girl in your English class? And how many times have you thought, that really could have gone better? For sure, I think I probably stressed out about this more the very first day of class. What am I going to say in that first 5 minutes? How am I going to convince them that I'm worth listening to? And I've been at this for 15 years, so this is pretty normal. Let me put it for you this way first. By the end of your introduction, which in a short paper is usually one paragraph, the reader should know a few things. First, why is this worth knowing about, worth reading about? So what is important about your topic? If you don't know that as the reader, your reader's going to have a hard time figuring it out by themselves. They should know what specifically you're arguing about. So what is your topic within that whole mess of things you can potentially get at? And they should have some idea of what to expect going forward. And there are lots of ways you can do this effectively, but we have means. So here's an example of an effective introduction. Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father, prepare to die. That was an atrocious accent. But if you think about it, it's actually a pretty good introduction. You have your greeting, and he was a very friendly guy. He says, this is who I am. He says, this is who you are, to the six-fingered man. And he says, this is what's coming up. Hopefully, you will not start any papers by telling your readers to prepare to die, unless perhaps you're talking about their eternal destination, which is a slightly different tone. But hey, you do evangelism your way. All right, slightly more seriously here. When you sit down to write an introduction, rather than trying to put everything you think into one paragraph, kind of dump the whole paper there, I want you to use the metaphor of a funnel. Now, so a funnel is wide at the top and narrow at the bottom. It's kind of like this. Your job is to narrow down the subject of your paper as you go from theme to topic to thesis. What do I mean by that? Well, theme is a big category, something that obviously extends beyond that specific example. Here, let's say wealth, money. A topic is one example of that theme. Now, if you're writing about a text, it should obviously connect to the thing you're writing about. So our sermon on Sunday was on the parable of the rich fool in Luke 12. This is the guy who has a really good year, and he says, what I'm going to do is I have so many crops that my barns are bursting, and so I'm going to tear them all down, build new barns, put all the stuff in there, eat, drink, and be merry, and enjoy life. And then we get kind of harsh, and God says, you fool! Tonight your very life will be demanded from you. And I guess the lesson is don't build bigger barns, but the preacher probably had a better lesson to do. Okay, so it's about wealth, sort of, but there's also a lot of potential things you could draw from that, particularly in the context of the passages surrounding it. And so you're going to end up with a thesis. As I said last week, this is a potentially controversial argument. Someone could legitimately disagree with it. It should be based on careful observation, what you see, in this case, in the text. And it should have specific rhetorical goals. It's not just the fish sticks are gross in the cafeteria kind of argument. So, the intro is your preview. You're not going to give your entire argument, but you're going to show that you do have something thoughtful and interesting to say, because your persuasion starts with word one. Convince your reader to keep reading. You got the hook. Say, now let me tell you why you should care about this. Whoops, my animations don't work here. Oh well. Conclusions, another tricky part, but you can also break this down. So, we're going to look at two key questions for your conclusions. So what, and now what? So what is about significance? So why should we care as your readers about this argument? Now what is about next steps? Applications. Observation, interpretation, application. Good way to do a sermon, right? So, as you wrap up your paper, fight the urge to just copy and paste your introduction. Even your thesis statement only needs to be there once at the start of your paper. Instead, answer so what? What did you present here that's new or interesting? What kind of patterns did you demonstrate? How are you arguing in the case of paper one about communication? How have you developed and ideally complicated that original claim? So if you started out by telling me that gender differences caused miscommunication in this case, all right, how did those work out? What was it about the particular differences or particular people involved that led to this problem? Now, summary is not bad here. You can summarize, especially in a longer paper, where you've been, but do it as a summary. Present it as, so we've seen that X, Y, and Z. Good preachers do this all the time, right before they get to the part of, as we stand and sing, or join me in a closing prayer, or the offering box is in the back of the room, or something like that. And that's different from repetition, because you're showing kind of, what is the culmination of the argument? What difference does it make? One way to do that is to show an application. So if you have a persuasive element, your reader's going to think differently at the end. They should be able to decide, what is new about this? Is it new information? Do we have more tools? Is there something that's going to help us understand this little corner of experience better? Now, in some cases, if you're dealing with personal narratives, you can talk about your own application. And I saw some of you doing that to good effect in the rough drafts of paper one. where you might say, you know, I had this time where my dad and I just really did not get along, and we were coming at this from completely different perspectives. But now that I understand him better, I can approach this relationship better. I understand the situation, or I'll be on the lookout for stuff like this in the future. But remember, you're always writing for your readers. So the takeaways should be something that they can apply as well. So give yourself plenty of time for both your intro and conclusion, and do plan to revise it. I tend to leave more feedback on intros and conclusions because there's a lot more going on there. But I think it's worth revisiting both of those sections in a revised draft, saying, how could I improve this? How can I clarify what I'm trying to do here or what I've done now that I have a better grasp of what I think? So I hope those are helpful as you finish up paper 1 and move on to paper 2. Let me give you some details on paper 2 because it's a doozy, and we're going to be going through a lot of fairly complex material to analyze these ideas. The main text for paper 2 is an article, is actually a conference paper delivered at an academic conference by John Swales. It's called Approaching the Concept of Discourse Community. And what you're going to do over the course of several assignments is learn to summarize and define what a discourse community is, and then pick 2 communities you're in that you think qualify as discourse communities and show how communication works there. And that'll look slightly differently for each of the assignments. I'm going to walk you through that in a minute here. Now, here's my giant caveat for the next 2.5 weeks. This is a hard article. This was written by a specialist in rhetoric and communication. It is designed for other specialists in a scholarly context. None of you, I'm assuming, have PhDs in rhetorical theory or communication. If Dr. Beach is watching, okay, you have a PhD, but probably none of you students do. So, a couple of resources, and we'll come back to this in our writing workshop for this week. First of all, I have done a video lecture on reading scholarly sources. I've given you the YouTube link because it's 45 minutes long, and I don't have time to redo it right now. We'd be here all day. I want you to feel free to talk to me about this because I literally read scholarship for a living. I'm an editor, and most of the stuff I give is academic writing. So if you want to send me questions or you want to set up an appointment, come by office hours, you can do that. Dr. Beach also under week 4, the video there talks about discourse communities in more detail. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. I also want to let you know that the week 3 pre-writing is long and it's going to be pretty difficult. It is a heuristic worksheet, and the instructions for that are, of course, on MyFire, but it's going to take a lot longer than the previous pre-writing, which was that 10-minute pre-write. So you want to budget plenty of time for that. Definitely, you should take a look at those assignments if you haven't done so already, and get a sense of how you budget your work sessions for that. The good news is, once you have that worksheet done, the essays for weeks 4 and 5 are going to go a lot faster. Let me show you what I mean in this timeline. So the worksheet is the first check-in point. That will be due Saturday, September 12th. You're going to have to read Swales' essay first and have a pretty good idea about how this concept works. And I'll talk you through that in a minute as well. After you answer those 10 questions about the concept, you're going to describe 4 communities you're in that you think may qualify as discourse communities. And I want you to think pretty broadly about community here. Your SAU class, in the sense of like your cohort of students, could be a community. Those of you, especially if you're on a branch campus meeting in person. But it could also be your coworkers. It could be your small group at church or in a ministry of some sort. It could be your family. The idea is to think, how do each of these groups communicate within themselves? And so I'll come back to that, show you how that might work. On Tuesday, September 15th, you're going to turn in part 1 of paper 2. Now, this one's relatively short. You need to have at least 300 words. You can go over if you need to. And you're going to summarize Swale's definition of a discourse community in your own words, so no direct quotes on this one, but you should add citations when you summarize his work. And again, the stuff in the conversation on using evidence will help there as well. So that's the first part of the paper. Our peer exercise for that week, this is going to be for which is still week 3, you're moving into week 4, the kind of branch 3, 4, and 5 here. On Thursday the 17th, you will post part 1, so that 300 words, on the peer review discussion board. That's separate from the week 4 board, so make sure you put it in the right spot. That's on MyFire, of course. Your classmates will read it and critique it. There is a link there to a peer review worksheet. Again, something you want to download and have a copy on your hard drive. And the deadline to do the peer review is Tuesday, September 22nd. So you've got the long weekend there, the 5 days. And this is actually going to be pretty easy compared to the other discussion board posts. Obviously, the first one all you have to do is upload it. Some people find it more helpful to copy and paste, since it's only 300 words. If you want to do that, that's okay. I don't recall offhand if there are actual instructions on how to do that. So that's the first half of the assignments. As we move through to weeks 4 and 5, we're going to work on the second part of the paper. This will be due in week 4 on Saturday, September 19th. For this one, you're going to start analyzing your communities. So you're going to choose 2 of the ones you mentioned on that worksheet, which is why it's helpful if difficult. And you're going to write at least 600 words, roughly split between the 2 communities, about how they function as discourse communities. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a couple of slides here. From there, you're going to use feedback you've gotten on part 1, the 300-word summary. I will give you feedback, your peers will give you feedback. And you're going to combine that, put it in an intro, thesis, and conclusion, so you make it an argument. And that's going to be the rough draft of part 2. So with me? Okay. The big one is in week 5, Saturday, September 26th. You're going to revise part 2. Now, for the revised draft, some of the requirements are going to change. Particularly, instead of writing about 2 communities and about 300 words each, you're going to write about 1 community at greater length. So the overall length will be the same, but you're going to adjust the audience and you're going to adjust your focus. Read those instructions carefully. Don't just do the revisions that I told you to do on the rough draft, because that's not going to fulfill that assignment. So there's a lot going on here, but this is spread out. And so I want you to think of it as contributing to points over the next 3 weeks, 3, 4, and 5, as we finally put that to bed in week 5 and move on to paper 3 in week 6, 7, and 8. All right, to give you a head start on that, I want to go over Swale's standards for defining a discourse community. And I'm going to give both his terms and then kind of explain what I think he means by them, because I hope that will help you figure this out. I've given you some more resources at the end of this presentation about how to look at that. So Swale's first standard, what he calls a communality, I don't even know how to say this word, that thing of interest, common interests. As he defines it, as he explains it, he's talking about specifically public interest, not necessarily in the sense of the general public is interested, but in the sense that all the group members share this commitment. So if you are thinking about a group of employees as a discourse community, then they share interest, hopefully, in improving the company's revenue, selling more, whatever it is, widgets. If it's a church, maybe they are trying to advance a particular part of a ministry or trying to lead a particular section, or trying to support a particular cause or candidate or issue. There's lots of discourse communities out there. And so this is perhaps the simplest definition, because we sort ourselves into groups pretty easily. Think of something like Facebook or Twitter. Maybe there are certain accounts that you follow, pages on Facebook or hashtags on Twitter, that you follow because you have an ongoing interest in that thing. I have groups that have basically no overlap, but I happen to be interested in both of them. So like I'm in a couple, I don't know, like 5 or 6 groups on checkers and drafts. I'll talk more about that in a little bit, actually. But I'm also in a few groups on Scrabble, and a few groups on chess, and a few groups on politics, which I'll say as little about as possible because it's just depressing. The second standard he calls mechanisms for intercommunication between members. This is actually a really simple concept. It means that the people in the group talk to each other, write to each other, sign to each other, whatever they do to communicate with each other in some interesting and easily identifiable way. So there's the possibility of communication and of miscommunication, I suppose. These groups also survive partly by providing information and feedback. So it's not just a one-way, here's your information, I'm going to tell this to you, but it's a process of maybe self-reflection, maybe critique, maybe analysis. One way to think about this is members are sharing information here with the goal of improving the community. So if you are in a nonprofit organization like a church, then part of what you talk about is, how can we do this better? Like a lot of churches right now are trying to figure out when and how should we meet. Can this be in person? And there are often laws and social standards, shall we say, and legitimate concerns and not so legitimate concerns about how to do that. In California, we're still not legally allowed to meet in church. It's a whole big thing. John MacArthur's not happy about it. And so one of the things that, for instance, the ministry staff or the elders or whatever group is kind of working on this might do is say, hey, I think that we could improve this by adding this feature, or by communicating this way, or by changing this policy. So my church, Trinity Church in Redlands, California, check out their website, they're awesome, has started doing more outdoor services because there's a lot more space outside, and so they can do 6 feet social distancing, they can have masks. The problem was they have to do them at night because it's 115 degrees here during the day, and so they needed lighting. And so they actually just invested a lot of time and money into redoing all the outdoor lights. They have like strings of kind of carnival lights now. It actually looks really cool. And so that's going to help them improve the community in some way. And it's an ongoing process. Fourth, what he calls genre-specific discoursal expectations. Yeah. All right, let me see if I can break this down for you. Essentially, this means that members in this community communicate with each other in certain ways. Not just in terms of do we speak to each other, or do we write to each other, but in all the other variables that go into communication. Many groups have specialized vocabulary. Christianese, for example. If you say, man, you just gotta take up your cross daily, and you're talking to someone who doesn't know that reference, like, what? Wait, cross, what, why? Or you gotta die to yourself, man. What? You must be born again. John 3. Okay, this is confusing. And that's kind of the point. That when you have these linguistic choices, these communicative choices, they don't always make sense to the outside. That the vocabulary that I use in my groups with my friends who share those interests is going to be very confusing to people who don't understand that. It's like when I try to talk about science fiction around my wife. She's like, Star Wars, Star Trek, whatever. Like, Star Trek, Star Trek. We can also here think about different genres of communication, and I'll show you an example of how that works a little bit later. It's a little more easy if it's concrete. Fifth, this one's another mouthful. Possession of an embedded dynamic towards an increasingly shared and specialized terminology. Breathe. What Swales is trying to say here is that members of these groups develop their own language, and not only do they use those terms in the group, whether that's jargon or preference for particular language or dialect, but they get more and more sophisticated so that it's that much harder to kind of join the group and understand what the heck they're talking about. How many inside jokes do you have with your friend groups? And how many times have you made some reference and someone else says, wait, what do you mean asparagus? And the friends who know jokes say, asparagus. Yeah, I know, yeah, it's asparagus, right? So good. The point is that the more you develop that form of communication, the harder it is for someone outside of the group to understand you. So the increasingly shared and specialized terminology means it's not just one or two things that only make sense if you know the immediate context. It's that by the time you really dive into that community, most of what they talk about is going to be incomprehensible to an outsider. There's a plus and minus there. And lastly, what he calls a critical mass of members with a suitable degree of relevant discoursal and content expertise. A lot of long words. All he means here is that this group has experts, maybe people who've been there for a while, people who are specialists in certain areas. Your boss is hopefully an expert at your job, but also that members develop expertise over time, partly by being exposed to this new language, to this new way of talking. So if you've been in the friend group for a while, some of the inside jokes makes more sense. And some of the references that nobody bothered to explain to you is like, oh, okay, now I get that. More than once I've joined a group and it's like, I see you using those words, and those are definitely all words, but I have no idea what they're supposed to mean in that context. As an academic editor, I run into this very often because I'm editing maybe an engineering article. I don't have an engineering degree. And so I have to figure out, okay, what's the who's he what and the thingamajig that you're trying to get to work together, and why do you keep using all those weird numbery things to describe it? You will get there over time. I'm going to give you an example of how this works, and I'm going to switch back to the main video for a minute because I want to do a little show and tell. So my example of a discourse community I'm in is professional checkers. Yes, that's the game, the one with the red and sometimes black pieces, sometimes black and white pieces, sometimes red and white pieces, sometimes it's complicated. The one where you actually jump and jump and jump and say, king mate. It's a small community. In the US, we probably have, honestly, between 75 and 100 serious players. And before COVID, we would actually meet and go to tournaments. But there are actually groups of players, varying size, varying skill all over the world. And our goal then is to promote our game. So one of the ways we do that in terms of communication is through books. I have a modest checkers library. I wanted to show off a couple of things here. This book is rather old. This is from about 1900. This is a collection of historic and memorable matches, mostly from the 19th century. And if you actually look on the inside, it's got all these random lines of numbers. It looks kind of like a train schedule. An expert, and by that I mean someone who is familiar with the discourse in this little community, would recognize these as what we call index notations. It's the moves that they're making on the checkerboard. So each square has a number, and if I say from 11 to 15, I take the checker on square 11, I move it to square 15, and you write down 11, 15 on your score sheet. You go from there. This book exists because one way to get better at checkers is to study what other strong players, in this case world champions, have done. We also have collections of tournaments and newsletters, stuff like this. This is a booklet. This was from 2001, and it's a series of games with explanations, annotations, ideas of a tournament that was played, in this case actually a postal tournament, played by mail, from 1999, probably. It used to take a long time to play. This particular tournament used a certain set of openings, so they played more difficult games than the typical tournament. And so part of their job is to analyze the really tough openings. This is probably my oldest book, so I'm going to be very careful with it. This is The Game of Drafts by John Gregg, one of the first books published on checkers in England. Well, not one of the first, an earlier one. This is from 1901. So this book is more than a century old, which is why it's kind of falling apart here. I believe I had a book from about 1895 or so. I ended up selling it partly because I needed to sell some of my library to pay for moving for college expenses, actually, when I was finishing college, going to grad school. Also, the previous owner of the book was a very, very, very heavy pipe smoker, and so the book smelled terrible. I couldn't open it without coughing, so I let someone else. Finally, this is a recent book that came out in 2017. This is a thick book called Complete Checkers by this guy, Richard Pask. And it is an encyclopedia. And I mean that literally. It goes through openings and it says, this is how you play it. This is where people in the past have done this. This is an important match game with this. This checks it against computers because, believe it or not, we have computer programs that can run on a typical laptop or desktop that can beat grandmasters. It's a strange new world to play in. Now, as I said, I have a modest library. I have friends who own hundreds of these things and who just collect books and magazines and games and memorabilia for decades of their lives. And so they get really, really familiar, not just with how to play on kind of a skill level, but with kind of the history and the literature of checkers. And so that's one way that we communicate. Switch back to the notes here. So, all right. So obviously we can walk through this. Let me show you why I think this is a discourse community. We have a shared interest. We want to play and promote this particular style of checkers. There are other variants. Sometimes people play on a 10 by 10 board instead of 8 by 8. We have different mechanisms to communicate. I showed you the books. We have newsletters. We have websites. We have several Facebook groups or pages. We have places where you can play online. I play at goldtoken.com and occasionally at playok.com. And yes, I'll beat you at both of those places. We have ways of giving feedback. There are officers in the organizations that organize these events. There's politics. Oh, boy, is there politics. But people also publish articles. We run meetings before tournaments. We campaign. Long ago in a galaxy far, far away, I was the treasurer for one of the main organizations here in the US. I've been webmaster. I ran a checkers newsletter for a number of years. I have been a tournament referee. I got to go to Italy and referee a world championship match. That was a lot of fun. And of course, we just have regular conversations. Players talk. And say, what I'd really like to see is a better website to play checkers, or I'd really like to see more material for the youth, or all this other stuff that costs money and nobody's going to invest in. Not that I'm bitter. In terms of that phrase, discoursal expectations, that just means the kind of things, the kind of ways you expect to communicate. Well, we've got our books, but we also have certain ways of understanding how these games work. So sometimes you analyze a whole game. You might mark up, here's where this move is different from the normal move, or this move is really bad and this move is really good. You might say, this person has tried this move before with this result in this tournament 20 years ago. But there are also problems. So if you know chess at all, this is actually really similar. In a problem setting, maybe you say, all right, the goal is to find a move that wins for red or for white. Or the goal is to draw this really tough position. Or the goal is to analyze what actually happens in this setting. Sometimes we will have live analysis. I did some of that when we would broadcast games. So one of the things I actually pioneered for the checkers community was webcasting matches. And it started off very simply, got a tiny little webcam perched on my laptop, and I just set that up on the table where two grandmasters were playing, and we put it on the internet. And people would join the chat rooms and say, oh man, that was a really interesting move. I wonder if it's going to see this move and this response, and what about this? And no, I think this is going to be a red win or a white win. It's a way to generate interest and a way to encourage people to keep playing, that deepening of the community. We've got lots of specialized terminology. Oh boy. One is kind of a funny story. So we have two main styles of checkers at the tournament level. One is called go as you please, or freestyle more often now. And the other is called three move. So complete checkers is a three move opening book, which means that it starts with opening to draw actually out of a deck of cards. This one is 10, 14, 23, 18, 14, 23. That's a really hard opening, actually. So there's going to be a lot of analysis to it. In freestyle, you can move wherever you want. That's probably how you're used to playing. Now, when I first started studying checkers, there weren't a lot. I didn't really have books. I didn't know they existed yet. But I knew there were websites. And so I printed off this website that said, Go As You Please Opening Guide, except it abbreviated to GAYP. And my mom saw the printout, and she said, John, why are you reading about gay P? And I had to explain to her what the jargon was in that case. All of this can serve to confuse outsiders, and that's, in one sense, the point. It also makes it somewhat difficult to join the community, but it's a trade-off. Lastly, we have certainly different levels of expertise. When I was actively studying and playing in tournaments, it's been several years now, I was ranked about 50 in the world. I never quite got to the world championship level, but I was playing with a lot of the players who did. One of my proudest moments was I got a draw with Ibalo Conlo, who at that point was the highest rated player in the world, and he's since become a world champion. So that was a really fun game for me. But in tournaments, we have different divisions. And so I might play in the majors division or the B division, and the masters might play in the top division. We have different models of training or mentorship, working with more experienced players. We have textbooks like the ones that I showed you. All these things are ways to develop expertise. Now, this is going to look different from your discourse communities, but I present it as a way you can think about how do they communicate. Maybe there aren't books, maybe you have a group text. Maybe you always have, you have a private Facebook group or something, or maybe you always call each other or talk or have dinner on Friday nights or whatever it is. So what I want to encourage you to do as we wrap up for our week 3 writing workshop, discourse community is going to be the central concept and also the difficult one. Instead of just jumping in and trying to read Swale's article, I want you to start with some of these other resources. Go to the week 4 content on MyFire and watch Dr. Beach's video. It's a good introduction to the concept. There's also a resource linked on week 3 called Understanding Discourse Communities. And I give you 3 other links here that you can use to wrap your head around this pretty complex idea. So there's a lot going on here. We're going to be writing a lot and talking a lot about that as we move to the next few classes. Give yourself plenty of time, and please email me if questions come up. I will see you, those of you on the hybrid section, in class on Wednesday. Everyone else, email me as questions come up. I want to make sure we all put together some good work in for paper 2. See you next week.